Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to our new installment of the Beeper Talk series. I'm Eugene Finkel, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest for today, Professor Jeffrey Kopstein, who is a professor of political science and the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of California, Irvine. Jeff is a wonderful, prominent scholar of things that go sideways. His first book was The Economic History of East Germany, on which he was working in 1988, 1989, then moved, and then other happier topics like a wonderful book on, very prominent book on pogroms of summer 1941, which he wrote with Jason Wittenberg, a recent edited volume on the social science of the Holocaust, which he co-edited with Yelena Subotic. And now he's here presenting his new book on the assault on the state. So, Jeff, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for everybody coming. Thank you, Eugene. Now, I always know Eugene as Yevgeny, but I will get used to it in 20 years, I suppose. He's right. I do write on things that go sideways. I'd written on East Germany while the wall was collapsing. That was almost the collapse of my personality at that point. And then I moved to the University of Toronto, and I was threatening to write on Canada. Because that would, of course, Canada was always on the verge of dissolution. And then I wrote about the Holocaust. And really, this was a book that Steve Hansen and it was hatched during COVID. Let's see if I can get this to go forward. I'm having a little trouble moving.
Maybe we'll respond. No,
yeah. And there's the cover. The press was nice enough to issue this. So Steve and I we've been friends for 40 years, and we had this COVID puzzle, which came when all of us were doing the same thing, sitting in front of our television sets and at home, figuring out. And the question that started to occur to us as we were watching each day these COVID briefings from the White House, and we all remember those very well, was why couldn't the public agree on the most basic health policies? And why couldn't they be adopted consensually? I mean, even in highly developed countries like the US and the UK and my native Canada, these were all highly politicized. And when we started looking at it more deeply, it ceased to be just a Trump story. And that was, of course, the temptation was to make it a Trump story. But it ceased to be just that. Really what we saw is that all of our kind of public goods that were produced by the state seemed to be under attack. And so when we started looking around, we decided this was an assault on the modern state itself. And I'm going to come to, if you haven't read, Eugene told me that you guys have been assigned a few pages to read for this, some of them. So I'm going to explain to you. You don't have to read them. I'm going to explain to you what it's about. The important thing is not that you read the book. The important thing is that you buy the book. Okay. So why turned into a kind of a book that was a kind of a defense of the modern state. But why would we defend the state? After all, for Americans love to hate the state. That's our thing, right? Our thing is state bad, market good, right? I learned that in economics. I took an economics class. And I was a student, Steve was a student of communism and the collapse of communism. We learned that the state was bad and the market is good. Now, how in the world did we get around to trying to defend the modern state? Well, it only came about because if you looked at pre-modern states existed, but they largely were kings and queens, their viziers who relied on quacks, soothsayers, and cronies for their policy advice. They used indiscriminate violence to control their populations. It's not, pre-modern states were better than anarchy, right? So if you can think about it, if you have pre-modern states and traditional, or we're going to call patrimonial states, They were better, these patrimonial states, than anarchy. They could and did provide public goods, but mostly they were what Charles Lindblom, and that's where I've taken this phrase from, the political scientist from Yale, who said, these early states were all thumbs and no fingers. All they could do was apply very crude force. It's not that public goods didn't get provided. I'm going to assume you guys are really smart. You know what a public good is, but we'll come back to that in a minute. But to the extent that they were provided, they were only provided because it comported with the ruler's personal needs. And these types of states, I think one of the things that COVID was starting to teach us, if they would have been that way, they are completely unable to handle the challenges of the 21st century. Global pandemics, climate change, food security, food safety. The state is like the air we breathe. It's only when it doesn't exist that we pay any attention to it. When we want it, but we can't have it. When somebody stands up in front of us in the midst, and I don't want to make a political point here, but it's hard not to, stands up in front of the greatest pandemic we've had in the last 100 years and says, drink bleach. While the expert is sitting in the background with her head in her hands. It's only under those circumstances do you say, I don't want that. I want my state. I want a Pentagon level response with the experts to this. I don't want the soothsayers. Now, in the United States, the book starts with the United States. The assault on the state is actually a much deeper process, and it goes back to really this deep state conspiracy theory, which has been around now for some years. The interesting thing is the idea of the deep state, these dark, shadowy forces that are actually pulling the strings. This goes back to Turkey, right? To an incident in 1996, which was a car accident in which the head of the Turkish Secret Service got into a car accident while driving the head of the mafia. And in this case, there really was a conspiracy to act against Islamists, leftists, and of course, for drug dealing. And that was exposed. And that idea then spread to the American left, right? And some of my own professors at Berkeley when I was an undergrad believed in that there was a kind of a deep state run by the oil companies and the pharmaceutical companies to control our polity. But eventually, along the way, this idea spread to the American right. And of course, Steve Bannon was using it, and he used this idea of smashing the deep state and then smashing the administrative state. And in the American mind, and I'm sure maybe even some of your minds, right? This similarity, the equivalence between the idea of shadowy forces and administrative state, that exists. And the administrative state is simply when Congress allows institutions that it funds to enact the laws that Congress passes by administrative regulation. That is the administrative state. But in that idea of the deep state, it migrated to the right in the United States in an attack on from the deep state to the administrative state. Now, in the US, and it's not just in the US, what produces this is a kind of an unholy alliance, if you will. I don't call it, it's an alliance. I don't know if it's unholy or not, but it's an alliance between three strands of American thought. The first, and it's a much older one, it exists in the United States, it exists in Italy, it exists in Canada, it exists in Great Britain, and this is libertarianism. Going back to the ideas of Ayn Rand and Friedrich Hayek, and that is the original state bad market good. The state in any form except the most minimal night watchman state that enforces property rights and contracts ultimately leads to tyranny. And this is a much older stream in the United States, which really took off in the 1980s when I first started going to college. and came to power. But it didn't stop there. In the United States, at any rate, but not just in the United States. There are also what you might call cultural nationalists, or in the US, it's religious nationalists. In Great Britain, it's cultural nationalists. In Canada, you have religious nationalists. In Israel, you have religious nationalists. And the idea here is that the state ultimately uses its power to redistribute from in the case of the United States, rather than between classes, which is what the libertarians fear. In the United States, it's between ethnic groups or races. And so it is ultimately used for an attack on religious majority groups and, of course, national majority groups. These two became the kind of dominant ideological strands of the attack on the state, but they were joined by a third. And to understand that, where that comes from, you have to go all the way back to the Nixon administration in the United States. And the idea there is that if we're going to have a state, the state should be run by an executive with virtually, even if elected, with virtually unlimited power. The judicial branch should have no authority whatsoever to oversee the executive power. In the United States, this was called the unitary executive theory, but it exists in virtually every country in the world. Israel recently tried to do a replication of that. The reason it goes back to the Nixon administration is the argument that was made by Nixon's proponents once he was impeached and forced to resign from office was that he was railroaded out of office by the legislature, by Congress. And he shouldn't have been. And ultimately, this is a very interesting little fact that you might know or not know. His Solicitor General was a guy named Robert Bork. And Robert Bork was nominated by Reagan to be on the Supreme Court. And Robert Bork was turned down. And Bork was the one who initially argued in favor of the unitary executive theory. These guys still exist. They're mostly now, because they're out of power, they're professors. John Yoo at Berkeley, right? Who, to my mind, will if Donald Trump comes back to power, will have an important position in that administration. What all three of these can agree on, they don't agree with each other very much. The irony is if any of them came to power, they would actually hurt the others. So if libertarians might be hurt by Christian nationalists if they come to power. Those who believe in unlimited executive power, well, that might be good for Christian nationalists if it was a Christian nationalist executive, but not if it was Bernie Sanders, right? And so while all three of them can see in somebody like a Donald Trump, somebody they might like, who prefers their agenda, Trump himself is a kind of focal point. He's a focal point, and ultimately, while none of them are in favor of what we call patrimonial authority, and it's not what we call it, this goes back to Max Weber, and I'm going to come to it in a minute. All of them can see something in him that they like. And so that's what we think to be the kind of American ideological story. So what? Within current political discourse and political science discourse, there's a lot of discussion about the threats to democracy. You guys are taking a class on autocracy, and I guess one of the things you're learning about is where autocrats come from. And there's a lot of discussion. You know, my good friend Daniel Ziblatt wrote this book, How Democracies Die. What we're doing in this book is not so much talking about how autocrats come to power. We're talking about what happens when a certain kind of leader comes to power, what they do to their own state administrations. This dominance of the democracy versus autocracy frame, we think has sort of warped the discussion. We forget that dividing up the world into democracy for the autocracy versus autocracy, it's pretty much of a new phenomenon. It's only since World War II. And it only draws attention to the conditions under which leaders ascend to power, but not how rule is carried out. That is, it ignores what is sometimes called governance. Now, why not just label these guys populists? Well, the problem is that, of course, we know that democracy is under threat. All of the indices out there, Freedom House, Voice and Accountability, the VDEM, all of these indices of democracy all point to a decline in democracy for a couple decades now. But the idea that there's so many studies of populism and everybody's labeled a populist. Both Putin and Navalny have been labeled populists. Trump and Bernie Sanders have been labeled populists. If you do the Google test, everybody's a populist. And what that means is nobody's a populist, right? The term has been so stretched that it's ceased to really have any meaning. And this term itself probably doesn't do justice to not only how these guys come to power, but what they do when they come to power. And you'll notice I use the word guys. It is almost completely guys, although I'm very attuned to the fact of where I am. And we can talk about Italy a little bit, although coming to a country that you're not a native and telling them how their politics are run is kind of crazy, which I'm not going to do. But we can talk about that. Okay, so let me pull back for a minute. Most people have talked about democracy versus authoritarianism. But the problem with this is that all of rule is kind of drawn down to whether politics is degrees of rule by the leader versus the people. And the rule of law and bureaucracy, that is the state itself, it becomes part of the definition of democracy rather than something orthogonal to it. And we're making the argument these are two completely different things, not totally unrelated, but usefully seen along different dimensions. Where do we get this from? Well, in comparative politics, as Yevgeny will agree with me, whereas in international relations, the international relations specialists are clear what the questions are, but they're not sure what the answers are. Comparative politics, we're not sure what the questions are, but we're sure the answer is Weber. That was supposed to be fun, wasn't it? Okay. Rather than the selection of leaders, rather than studying how leaders come to power, the key question in politics is obedience. Is obey who and under what conditions will the commands of the leader be obeyed? No matter how anybody comes to power, whether it's elected or unelected, if obedience does not occur, there cannot be rule. Now, this is always probabilistic. It is never absolute, but it's most likely to occur, Weber tells us, when rule is legitimate. That is, when you consider it your duty to obey. Not when you're paid, not just because out of habit. Those are Weber's two other methods of rule, but because it is your duty to obey because it is legitimate. Now, in practice, the important thing is the link between the ruler and the ruler's administrative staff. In practice, there are only two reasons why this might occur, why obedience might occur. Only two. That is, the link may be highly personal, emotional, intimate, based on friendship, respect. And this is how rule has been carried out for most of human history. Or it's impersonal and legally specified. That is, you don't obey the president in the United States or the prime minister in Italy or the chancellor in Germany because you like the chancellor. You obey the chancellor because the rule is The order is from the chancellor, from the office of the chancellor. Now, it's not like in the United States or in other places, we don't have islands of traditional authority. And these are obviously kind of ideal types in the sense of pure types. But to the extent that we have a pure type that of non-modern authority in the United States, it's the Godfather. It's the mafia. That is, you'll remember, how many of you have read or seen The Godfather? That first scene when Buenos Aires comes in to his office on the day of his daughter's wedding. And what does he ask for? He says, my daughter was raped. I want you to kill the rapist. And he says, the Godfather says back to me, you never came in here before. You never showed me any respect. Why don't you go to the state? Why don't you go to the police? He said, I did. And all they got was they were found guilty, but were given suspended sentence. What I want is justice. And so what he did, what does the Godfather do then? He says, well, you have to do a favor for me at some point or another. I can't tell you what that favor is going to be. And at that point, the guy kisses the Godfather's ring and the deal is sealed. So for most of human history, that's how rule was carried out. This bond was emotional. It was based on respect and friendship. But finding underlings is not easy. Finding a staff is not easy in the absence of a civil service. And so for the most part, in patrimonial societies, rule is carried out by friends and family of the ruler. That is the principle of delegation. And our point in that, in the modern world, in the absence of the rule of law state, we would not have a flowering of liberty and markets, but a return to the rule of men, to patrimonialism. Not neo-patrimonialism in the sense of how rule is carried out in Afghanistan, but a return to the original form here in the developed West. And that is, to the extent that we have a key theoretical insight in the book, that's probably it. Now, where did this all come from? The standard explanation for authoritarian populism is kind of rising inequality and changing demography. That is, people in the West no longer like their socioeconomic position, nor do they like the fact that they've lost ethnic advantage in the face of growing ethnic heterogeneity because of either the extension of equal rights to formerly discriminated against ethnic minorities or immigration. And patrimonialism, it sort of emerges as the kind of main solution to anti-liberal state building. And that becomes the supply side, whereas the demand side for patrimonialism is the kind of the evils, if you will, of neoliberalism and rising ethnic heterogeneity. The supply side is these patrimonial leaders who come along. And a big part of our book, and I think probably the most controversial part of the book, is we say this actually originates in Russia. This actually starts in Russia after communism. So let me talk for 2 minutes about Russia. When communism fell, the argument from the West was the state is bad and what you should do is get rid of your state, the communist state, and put in markets. But ultimately, this led to, anybody who was in Russia in the 1990s knows, right? This led to chaos and violence. And it discredited the entire idea of liberalism. And if you would say in Russia today, "Я демократ," "Я либеральный демократ," right? If you would say, "I'm a liberal Democrat," that would not be a good thing to say. Not just because you'd get thrown in jail, but because that would be a kind of a synonym for corruption. And so this idea of the connection between liberalism and democracy, with excesses, with theft, with the mafia, this was associated in Russia with the idea of chaos. And in many ways, Russia faced during the 1990s the same forces, the same challenges that we ultimately faced in the West after 2008. That is, a declining middle class, a Rust Belt, increasing economic inequality, a weak and unresponsive institutions. Nobody knew which levers to pull. Now, what are we not saying? We're not saying that Putin somehow runs the world at all. That is not, we're not going back to what has been called in the United States, the Russia hoax. Rather, we're saying that during the 1990s, there was this idea that grew, and it extended into the 2000s, that Russia is finished. And we were part of that, Steve and I. We believe that. We made a huge error. And the error was that the alternative to communism was going to be the market. And if the market started failing, and if the state was failing, what you'd end up with anarchy. And what we both did not understand is that there was an alternative mode of state building. And this was this patrimonial mode of state building, which Putin ultimately did. If you want to get ahead in Russia today, what you need to be, I'm talking very ahead, is loyal to Putin, personal loyalty. Russia's model for restoring state power became a kind of an antidote for failed liberalism. And it became increasingly attractive for opponents to the Western global order. Putin pitched himself as the father of the nation, as the good father, the restoration of the good father. And in 2008, the collapse of the global financial system created perfect conditions for patrimonial diffusion. That is, for not necessarily the export, although they were not against trying to export, but for the diffusion of patrimonialism from Russia to the West, from Russia to both authoritarian and democratic countries alike. So the question is, what does Putin want? What exactly does Putin want? Does he want to recreate the Soviet Union? And the answer to that is no, he doesn't. What he wants is a world of Putins. A world that his vision of the international order. And this extends from Russia to what was called the near abroad at one point in time. But it is now the former Soviet Union. It was easier for Putin to export this model to places closer to home, where you already had weak state institutions, where you had never had rule of law, Western style, legal rational bureaucracies. To Belarus, run by the former collective farm chairman, Alexander Lukashenko, who pitches himself exactly in the same way as the good father. To Azerbaijan, to Chechnya, we have a kind of a little mini Putin, right? Kadyrov, along with it, who has typical patrimonial features to his rule, ranging to a menagerie with, animals, with tigers that he's been rumored to. I don't have any proof of this, to have fed journalists to. People have a bad habit of disappearing. Where the rubber hit the road, however, was Ukraine. What did Putin want in Ukraine? I'm sitting beside Eugene Finkel, who's just written an entire book on the subject. The deal that had been tried over and over and over again was to make Ukraine a vassal state of Russia. Successive Ukrainian rulers since 1991 had more or less taken the deal. Not completely, and they resisted. What especially was resisted was Russian rule. It was resisted by Ukrainian civil society. Ukraine, before the Euromaidan, seemed to be a juicy prospect for reintegration, not into a Soviet Union, but into a kind of Don Corleone and the Five Families, sitting around the table, divvying up the loot, sometimes helping each other, sometimes killing each other. But that was to be the world. After the Euromaidan, and which we detail at great length in the book, this project collapses. Not initially, but eventually. And when the anti-Putin comes to power in Ukraine, Zelensky, rather than being the big man, somebody who made a career on being the little man. Now, he wasn't actually a little man, but that was the image, right? The images of the little man, the nebbish, right? He had a television show. That's exactly how he was portrayed, as a school teacher who goes on a rant. And this rant is about how terrible everything is in the country, how terrible the rulers are. And he finds himself a couple of days later as elected president of the country. As unlikely as that is, even more unlikely is that he actually became president with a party named by the same name as the television show, by the way, Servant of the People. It was this failed attempt to export the model, the patrimonial model to Ukraine, which brings about the invasion. More troubling was the diffusion of this, not from the former Soviet Union itself, but to an attempted diffusion to the new EU member states, and eventually to the heartland of the rule of law itself. It's easy to forget now how attractive EU membership was for the post-communist states. Many of them, Hungary, Poland, regained their sovereignty after 1989 and ran as hard as they could to Brussels. Well, what was the EU? What was EU enlargement actually all about? On the one hand, it was about democracy to some extent. And there were these Copenhagen conditions that they had to fulfill. They had to be basic democracies in order to get in. But even more important than that, if you wanted into the EU, you had to do this one simple thing. You simply had to pass these 88,000 pages of EU law into your own national legislation, the acquis communautaire. And then what they would do, the EU sent people to Central and Eastern Europe to the ministries. They seconded people to ministries in order to make sure that this was put into force as best they could. It was never perfect. But what I'm trying to say is what the EU was a state building project. It was essentially a state building project. It was a state building project in the service of regulating a large market. That's the idea. Why am I telling you all of this? I'm telling you all of this because exporting the model into the European Union required not simply killing off a rule of law bureaucracy that had not yet been born as in Ukraine, as in Belarus, but actually actively killing off a state building project that had been in place for over a decade. This was harder to do. But this is what Orban has been trying to do in Hungary. Putting in his own people, undermining the courts, undermining the civil service. And of course, along the way, he made friends, not only with Putin. That is, he was not bought by Putin. We're talking about an ideological affinity between patrimonial state building projects as opposed to rule of law state building projects. With the United States US Conservative Political Action Conference, which actually has been held in Budapest. And when it was held in Dallas, Orban came and spoke. Even Hungary might not be all that surprising, though it is if you were a student of Hungary, as I was, because it was considered the darling of the post-communist states. even more so than Poland. What's perhaps most surprising is the export of this to the erstwhile heartland of the rule of law. And so we have a whole section on Israel. The interesting thing about Israel is you have the same coalition of libertarians, religious nationalists, and unitary state theorists coming together. You have the same discourse. The word in the Israeli press, they use the word, the right-wing press, the deep state. Even more interesting in the case of Israel, and this is something which can easily get lost in the Western Academy. Historically in Israel, this was a state-building project. The Hebrew word, mamlachtiyut, which really is about, how would you, государственность, that would be the easiest Russian version, is stateness. It's the core of the Zionist project. And that was a project of the left, as Israel was run by the left from 1948 to 1977. Even when they were replaced by Likud, by right-wing governments in 1977, led by Menachem Begin, they did not destroy the civil service or the Supreme Court or the police or the prosecutor's office. All of that was held exactly in place. In fact, Netanyahu himself held it in place even when he came to power. In fact, in Israel, and this is something that's especially hard for Westerners to appreciate, the corrupt party was always the left. The corrupt party was always labor. Why? They'd been in power for so long. They ran the trade unions. The rule of law party, the party that favored Israel doesn't have a constitution, you might know. The party that favored the constitution was always Likud. They were the guys that wore ties. They viewed themselves as Western, as bourgeois, as liberals in the European sense of the word. They were always hard line on Palestinian Arab questions, but on this question of the state, they were not. All of that changes in 2015. Netanyahu starts to attack his own bureaucracy, using all the same language, which really culminated just this last year in the attack on the Supreme Court, in order to create a unitary executive, to do exactly what the American version wanted to do and what didn't need to be done in Great Britain. I'm going to leave out, for time purposes, UK here, though I'm happy to come back to it. And then, of course, we have the US under Trump. This is not a Trump book, although it ultimately sounds that way, I realize. Trump, even before he left office, he had done several things in the first term. One of them, which is one of the most interesting to my mind, is what's well known is that when they came to office in 2017, they dismantled a very small bureaucratic office, the National Security Council, that deals with pandemics. Bad move. But he couldn't have known that. What is less known, for example, is they moved the entire research and development arm of the Department of Agriculture, which, if I'm not mistaken, is the second largest department in the US government. They moved it to Kansas City. And what happened? Half quit. Just people, all these PhDs didn't want to move to Kansas City. A huge amount of expertise was lost. Just before he left office, something that Biden rolled back, he invoked what was called Schedule F. That was taking away the civil service protections of senior civil servants. And that comes back in Project 2025. It's a 900-page document, but you're going to have to take my word for it, which is drawn up by former Trump officials inside the Heritage Foundation. I'm going to leave out the Soros conspiracy because that deserves a whole book unto itself. Just what I will say is, if you want to see some of the things that are behind all of this, just put into any search engine, Fox News, Soros, news-related items. You will get, it's not simply that you'll get all these hits. They have actually organized it for you. Soros stories. They have created a rubric. I'm going to leave it out because that gets into conspiracy stuff, which I'll maybe leave to Q&A. So all of this leads to what we think to be, that political scientists love 2x2s. We don't include this in the book because this book is supposed to, the agent said, write it for dentists in Iowa. And so we tried to write it for dentists in Iowa, but this is for political scientists. This is really this kind of 2x2. One is that we're talking about here should be seen along a different dimension. You can have autocratic governments that are actually pretty well run. Historically, the Kaiserreich, in Germany, from 1871 to the end of World War I. And of course, Singapore. Again, not perfectly run, but they're run according, basically, even though these were authoritarian countries where parliaments were not really active, you didn't have parliamentary government, they were pretty well run. I put Canada in there because Canada always belongs in a good category. All my Canadian friends say that. But yeah, the countries that are both have rule of law bureaucracies and are democratic. But it is also possible to have countries that are democratic, but patrimonial. So Philippines is a great example of that. You just had a really good free and fair election in which the patrimonial Duterte was replaced by the patrimonial Marcos' son. And we don't think it does any good to confuse these things because, first of all, two things. One is these guys are mostly democratically elected. Patrimonial leaders, they don't mind elections. They're actually pretty good at them. What's more, all the people who voted for them, if you're actually trying to make the argument we're making, that the danger is different and in some ways more profound than dictatorship, you're going to alienate a whole lot of people who you should actually be alerting to this fact. And then, of course, you have the countries which are, both autocratic and patrimonial. And I'm happy to talk about China in the Q&A because it's a very interesting problem, which doesn't easily fit our schema, which is a big lacuna. I'll grant you that at the beginning. So how would you know you're dealing with a patrimonial system? And I'm going to end my talk in a minute. No, 1 minute here. 3 things we should be looking for. One is the promotion of the leader's extended household, family, cronies, and sycophants to state positions, and moving government away from state institutions to private reserves somewhere, right? Whether in the provinces, whether in Florida, wherever, right? You're trying to move it away from the site because for patrimonialism is seen primarily by people like us as when the government is a family business. It's a family business. It's not to say family businesses you can have good patrimonial leaders. You can. It's possible. You can get lucky. So first of all, when the business of state is moved away from the location of the state and given to non-state, non-civil service rulers. You should look for concerted attacks on state officials and the judiciary as unelected bureaucrats in league with shadowy forces. And third, and this is also an important part of the book, which we didn't talk about, was the subordination of experts and institutions of higher education that might challenge the leader's insights, that might challenge the leader's wisdom. And this is why they largely don't like universities. It's not simply the wokeness, though that's part of it. That's part of it. But it's also the entire role of expertise. One of my favorite cartoons is a New Yorker cartoon. It's a drawing. And it's a picture of an airplane. And in the airplane, the passengers are sitting there in the cabin. And one of the passengers gets up and he turns around and he looks at everybody and he says, "Who do these smug pilots think they are? Let's fly the plane ourselves." I know it looks easy what we're doing up here. It's not. It's actually difficult. Anybody who's stood up here knows that. So this downplaying of these 3 things at least give us a bit of a roadmap of the kinds of things we should be looking for. Now, no government is without this completely, right? We have the Bidens, We have the Trudeaus, right? There are families, right? The question is do you raise this to a matter of principle? Do you ignore the institutions and their rules in order to enforce that principle? So what is to be done? Last slide. Well, we think the first thing you need to do is have the proper diagnosis of the problem. It is not simply a matter of democracy. We think the problem is far more grave than that. Because if we're right, what we're going to be left with is states that are not able to handle the most important of challenges. Think about climate change. Slow moving, yet threatening to humanity. Rather than attacking every patrimonial leader as non-democratic, and we agree that democracy is a problem. We think that it's more important, or at least a different question, which is useful to focus on, that is the attack of the modern state over the past several centuries, that as it's developed over the past several centuries. Second, we need to defend the modern state despite its flaws as a kind of a marvelous institution. I'm not saying that every state institution should be the Department of Motor Vehicles, or that every state institution should be, what was it, getting your residency permit here in Italy. Yeah, not every state institution has to be like that. There's lots of room for reform. We can debate questions of how high and low taxes are, how much state, how little state, but whether we should have a state, that seems to be something which should not be on the table. The modern rule of law state. It's a wonderful invention. We should revere it. And unless you think the market is better under all circumstances, I simply ask you to get on the phone with a call center next time you lose your bags with an airline. After 50 years of ridiculing the state with a level that can only be compared with mother-in-law jokes, we think the arrow is usefully pointed in the other direction at this point. A lot of people give up easy and wealthy careers for careers in public service, which are lower paying, but require a huge amount of expertise. We should stop making fun of the people for that. We also don't believe that left-wing solutions will work, by the way. The idea of democratizing administration, and I can talk about that ad nauseum, or getting rid of meritocracy. The guy at Harvard, Michael Sandel. Yes, Michael Sandel has written a book against meritocracy, because I can go into that in the Q&A. None of the left-wing solutions work. In the end, our politics are actually sort of boring. We should be electing legislatures and enforcing law and governing societies through rule of law bureaucracies. I'm going to leave out Ukraine for a minute. Of course, patrimonial rule, we agree that it inevitably undermines the importance of electoral procedures and the integrity of electoral procedures and constitutional framework. In that sense, it's very hard to keep a democracy. You can't with a patrimonial state. But it helps to have a democratic, a legal, rational bureaucracy if you're going to keep a constitutional framework. So we see ourselves as defending democracy too. But there's something prior to democracy that needs to be defended if you're actually to have a democracy. So thank you very much for your attention. And I look forward to your questions and comments.
I will handle the laptop, so let's switch
Sure.
places. So just give us a second to I'll stop sharing this thing. Oh, you already.
So, but should I stand, because people won't be able to see if I.
Whatever you prefer.
I'll stand. But
Okay, so then let's stand. Okay, so let's open it up. And the first question goes to a student. So there are several. So yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Can I stand up or?
Yes, and please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Kim. I am a student of Finkel's, but not in the autocracy class. It's actually about Eastern Europe specifically, but
Right.
what you covered is very relevant to many countries in that region. So you mentioned that like one of the most like the main concern of yours is the undermining of state capacity and the bureaucracies that are necessary for that. This might seem a little bit of a strange question, but what role do you think, I guess, consulting companies have in that role of like undermining state institutions? Because when I like, go into public policy world, it seems like everyone is piling on to work for a nice consulting company because they just pay better and
Right.
they just pay better. But I have what's so funny?
Well, you're
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 right,
making
yeah.
my point.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, but like, but a part of me is very skeptical of like outsourcing so much of state work to some firm on the outside, and it also just makes things more expensive. So, like, what do you think? Like, do you think like consulting company like, and if they do play a negative role, how do we combat that? Because a higher salary is a huge source of employment for these companies.
Right. Thank you. Do you want me to answer them as they go, or do you want me to take
Yeah,
some?
and a bit later we will collect some.
Okay.
more, Yeah.
So I couldn't agree with you more. I know from the because I was involved in a bit of kind of post-communism capacity building in a kind of a consulting way myself. And you're completely correct. The consultants initially went into Eastern Europe and said, especially Russia, and said, what you really need to do is to get rid of your state. Because this is really what's holding you back. You need the market. Now, the problem is after communism, it was very, very difficult to go in and say, look, we realize you had an overweening state, but what you really need is the right kind of state, right? Not the state that you had was but all thumbs, but with fingers. But in fact, that's what was needed. And all of us, especially our age group, my little older than him, were all involved in telling these countries to develop your markets. Now, there was what happened in the international institutional sphere. People actually understood they needed to have state capacity. So there was these capacity building projects. One of my favorites was it's actually quite recently in Georgia, where they had a problem in Georgia of having streets where people with disabilities could cross. Because if you know Soviet cities planners, they had these переход, the underneath things that go underneath the streets and you pop up on the other side. And how they were going to deal with this, right? Well, rather than creating an American Disabilities Act style bureaucracy and ramps and elevators, which are expensive, what the consultants told them to do was to make an app. People who could help them around, right? Now, this was a disaster. It didn't work at all. It cost a lot of money to well-paid consultants. So the consultants themselves were simply creatures of the dominant set of ideas. And it was, Hayek's critique of communism was a correct critique. It came out of the critique of the planned economy was that if you're going to plan everything, there's a problem with information. Information is expensive, and only the market can provide you with information cheaply enough so producers can react with enough alacrity to produce the kinds of things you need. That was all true. But the problem is, what was ignored in all of that was the regulatory apparatus, which was like the air we breathe. It can feel onerous, but it's mostly not. It's mostly, it kind of works. It's what made our world safe, prosperous, and pretty healthy, right? And so, that's really the point. And yes, of course, I completely agree that creating incentives for people not to go into state work, but into highly remunerated consulting work that essentially advocates for outsourcing state functions into the private sphere. In the end, I think what that's turned into all too often is simply a deconstruction of state capacity. And what we see that is, whether you're in Toronto or in Los Angeles, look at our airports. We can't provide the public goods, right? And I've seen that in Europe too. It's less in Europe, right? But it's coming, don't worry. Right? We can't provide the public goods we need in order for our markets to function. because we can't even agree on what the public goods are or whether the idea of a public good is a good thing. Yes.
Okay, so, wow. Okay, so you know what? Let's collect several. So Nina, let's start with the back and then go.
Thanks. I'm Nina, assistant professor here in IR. I really like the framework and the 2x2, being a political scientist. And I guess my question is, it's a static model. It's descriptive at the moment, but obviously countries move, as you pointed to with the US.
Yeah.
And if I understood you correctly, one of the key factors explaining the model is the coalition between libertarians and religious nationalists, or at least it wasn't Israel.
And the unitary state people.
And the unitary state people. And I wondered if you could elaborate a little more on that, because I come from New Zealand. So I'm looking at that and I'm thinking we have libertarians that are very strong and in power, but we don't have the patrimonial state. So I wondered if there are non-cases where you haven't seen those three emerge or almost emerge but didn't. Because, yeah, that's where the movement happens and that's where the interesting explanation occurs.
Yeah.
So let's collect.
Let's
some. Yeah, they're
If I
also in the
forget,
back,
you'll
yes.
remind me, okay? So,
Yes.
yeah.
Oh, sorry. I'm at the very back, so I couldn't see. Thank you, Jeff. That's fantastic. One thing I did not quite understand in your lecture is how does Putin figure into this? You say, well, here comes Putin, and here's how it changes everything. But then you just went right back and you explained that what he's doing is far from unique, and certainly historically we've had similar situations, not just in Russia, but across the entire post-Soviet space. And indeed, if you're talking about patrimonialism, you could go actually back to Yeltsin and say, well, this is where it actually started in Russia. It's not under Putin. You could also go across the world. So why is it that you link it to Russia? I missed that little bit.
Okay, and one more question from, yes, so Hannah, I think it's you, yeah. Sorry, I don't see the face, yeah.
Yeah, hi, thank you. My name is Hannah. I'm wondering, in Loper Bright Enterprise v. Raimondo, when the Supreme Court overturned Chevron, they pulled the rug out of under the administrative state in the US.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, we've seen with Roe v. Wade what a role a Supreme Court case can play electorally.
Right.
And I'm wondering, is that happening with the Chevron overruling? And if it's not happening, why are the Democrats not using it? Thank you.
Those are really three excellent and difficult questions. So the first question, New Zealand. There are close calls and there are also unpure types, right? So Italy is a good example of that. In fact, the Maloney, as far as I understand it, right, had many of the phrases and many the same ideas as the patrimonial leaders, but didn't latch on to the Putin alliance for whatever reason. You can have in place, so New Zealand, of course, has libertarianism, just like Canada has libertarianism, right? And New Zealand also has Christian nationalism, right? It's there. What you have not gotten in New Zealand is the unitary state authority. Now, you could argue they don't really need it because they have a prime ministerial system where that by constitutional design, there's a unitary state authority. Ultimately, the way, and it's the way I view Canada as well, as a Canadian, is that these countries like Canada and New Zealand are very dependent upon broader global forces. And if Trump comes back to power in the United States, or there's a kind of a coalition, a patrimonial international around the world, that could become a sort of irresistible force within New Zealand itself. I mean, I'm not an expert on New Zealand. I know a little bit about it. The broader question that you're asking, though, is that even once you head down that road, is there a way back? Right? And I think that's the really important question. And the state itself, the modern state itself, there's a whole literature on state building, as you know very well, right? Which really was sort of dominated by, by Tilley, right? By Charles Tilley. Said, look, modern states come out of a very particular historical circumstance, and that was military competition. It's true, but recent scholarship has started to question that and say it was far more contingent. My worry is that once we deconstruct the modern state, for whatever reason, we may not be able to get it back as easily, and we may need it. if it came about for kind of a combination of learning and luck and military competition, well, if those circumstances aren't around again, simply the fact that we need the modern state will not necessarily give us the modern state. We could fail. The whole thing could fail. These three elements that I'm talking about, they exist in admixtures in different countries. For example, the libertarian feature of it, it doesn't exist in Eastern Europe so much. Although even the libertarian part of it, Putin was appealing to many people. He said, we don't want the state interfering with how we treat our women, for example. So it's there. That's the best I can do for an answer. So Sergey, we have a whole chapter on Russia, which I want you to read it, right? And I couldn't spend that much time on it. Putin does, it's interesting, in the Yeltsin era, there was a fishing around, you'll remember this, for a liberal national idea. They even had a contest, a national idea contest in the 90s under Yeltsin. That was supposed to be a liberal idea. Putin comes along and he's not exactly sure what he wants to do at first. And then he turns to this traditionalist ideal. He turns hard in that direction with the church, with gender relations, and of course, with his own image of being the father of the nation. And that becomes highly appealing. That combination of traditionalism, church, and the good father, that becomes highly appealing, not only within Russia, but abroad, right? In the rest of the world. Does that get at what you're asking? Yes, yes. Yes, but I said family and friends, right? And it's true. The friends part of it, of course, that many in Putin's government go all the way back to his days, not just in the KGB, right? But in Leningrad, right? When he was in his childhood friends. It's family in the mafia sense of family, that extended personal relations. Now, oftentimes, of course, in other countries, it is, right? It is actual family, right? In the case of Russia, it is not actual family. It is his extended personal network of loyalty that goes all the way back to the KGB in the Leningrad days. Yes, and I want to go, it partially so, right? Not only was Russia run that way in the 1990s, of course, the use of the word patrimonialism to understand Russia, it's Richard Pipes. He was the one who explicitly invokes it, right? With several pages on Weber in Russia under the old regime. This is the essential problem of Russia is it never had property rights. It never had property rights because the entire country was considered, wait for it, the patrimony of the ruler, unquote. Right? And so, yes, in some ways, this is a continuity story. There was an attempt in the 90s. It was an unsuccessful attempt, but an attempt in the 90s to create a liberal regime, but a liberal regime without the rule of law state, which was, to our minds, the kind of crucial error. Third question.
On Chevron.
Chevron.
Yeah.
We don't know yet. The ruling's too soon, right? This is an attempt. I mean, this is a completely explicit attempt by the Federalist Society to stack the courts with people who oppose the administrative state. And the administrative state is extremely important because if you have laws are very high level statements, but those require detailed regulation. But if Congress is not allowed to delegate, and this is the issue, is the doctrine of delegation. If Congress is not allowed to delegate to the departments the right to create regulations, the laws are meaningless. The laws will have no effect. Now, the ruling itself is a very complicated, detailed ruling. They leave themselves some wiggle room. All of that is going to be tested over and over again. In effect, that ruling was a kind of an ideological restatement without providing the kind of details that would be necessary to destroy the administrative state. But they're going to make a run at it. Why would they not? They're never going to have a better opportunity than now, especially if this is what they believe. I just don't think that, again, I'm not trying to make a point about whether I like it or not. I think my views are clear enough, right? I have my views, right? But I don't think they're going to like it when they get there. That's the problem, right? I don't think that the people themselves who want this are not, they don't actually understand what's on the other side of that door. What's on the other side of that door is not the free market. What's on the other side of that door is not the rule of law, but the rule of man. That's Aristotle, by the way. So yeah, more questions.
Okay, so let's move to the
Jeff.
front, and I apologize to my students. You will have another opportunity to ask questions later. So let's see. So Jennifer? Oh, just wait for the microphone.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed this, and I want to congratulate you for writing a big story. But I just want to draw you out a little bit on what your goal is with this, because I saw kind of three different things moving around. And so one is that you want to give us a new concept, patrimonial rule, to insert into the story about democracy versus autocracy, and to say, actually, we need this concept to understand the current world. The other goal is to maybe, and this draws on some of the other questions, is to engage us in a story about how this model of patrimonial rule developed and how it's diffusing, right? So we have to sort of look around at what those might be, and people may agree or disagree with you on diffusion. The other, and this is where I'm a little less clear, and I'd like to ask a bit of follow-up, is you want us to connect patrimonial rule to the attack on the modern state, and to say, I'm going to put words in your mouth, that this is one of the major causes, right? But I just wonder how you stack that up against alternative explanations for the attack on the state. And I was really interested, because I'm Canadian, about where you put Canada and where the bureaucracy itself is in here, right? So, you know, one might argue that, and particularly because you're talking about COVID as your starting point, that the civil service itself is part of the attack on the modern state, that it's risk aversion, that what has happened to the bureaucracy itself is part of this story, and that we might not understand the dynamics fully if we just say, this is the bogeyman, this is the bad thing, right? So I just wanted to draw you out on, because the first goal itself, just giving us the new concept, is already a lot. And I could imagine us doing a lot with it, but I just want to see where your own interests are taking you with the project.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So
Very
other
good.
questions? Yes, please, here at front.
So I had a question regarding the proliferation of CPAC, including new leaders such as Bukele in Nicaragua or Milei in Argentina, associating with figures such as Netanyahu, or the European equivalents of these parties such as the ECR Congress. Considering that there's all of these congresses across the globe which are bringing together these sort of patriarchal leaders, should we be worried? Like, is this a sign that we should be worried about the dissolution of the state across the world, especially here in Europe, where we could consider the state as a very strong institution? Should we be worried that the state is going to dissolve in the near future due to the creation of these parties?
Thank you. One more question. So Philip?
Thank you. It's actually going to be two questions, if I may.
But short.
Well, I'm Philip and I'm from Serbia, so I understand a lot of what you're saying, very much so. But the questions that are related to that. The first question is more related to the fact that a lot of the deep state narrative and a lot of that type of speak, in my opinion, or at least I see that as coming from a position where the politicians feel that the civil service is working against them, that the state apparatus is not allowing them to pursue their agenda, and that they were elected by the people that have a mandate to pursue it. So my question is more theoretical, and that is, where is the right level of political control over state institutions? Because it varies. In the United States, the secretary, the undersecretary, deputy, the assistant, they're all political appointees. Whereas, for example, in England, it's just a few ministers. So where is the right control? And does the level of control they exercise impact the existence of patrimonial movements? And if so, how so? And the other question, which is more related to the concept, is in a lot of these parties, it feels like they all come from a patriotic or nationalist side. Even the left wing ones come from a sort of nationalistic side. And I'm thinking about asking you, how much do you think that they consider the state to be a national affair? So not so in the family of the nation as like a family that it's their affair, and how much does that type of rejection of internationalism, international influence on the state impact their will to push against? And are they not so forced to do it, but do they do it because they want to keep it in the nation?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You want me to go for those three?
Yeah. Go for
So
it.
Jennifer, remind me of your third point, because that's the one I wanted to start with, but I couldn't.
Oh, just if we're going to see patrimonial governance, or I think you say patrimonial rule
Right,
as the primary cause of the attack on the
Yes,
state.
yes.
How do we stack it up against other possible
yeah.
causes?
So this is a bit of a semantic issue here, but I think it's important. For us, patrimonial rule is the outcome of the attack on the state, right? It is, so at the very end of all of that, right? When you say, only I can fix it, only I can do this, you need to trust me. I am the good father. I will look out for your interests. Or as Tucker said yesterday, sometime daddy has to come home. And you've been a bad girl, he said. He's talking about American society. It's very interesting. It's the outcome of those the three kind of forms of attack: libertarian, Christian national, and unitary state proponents. The outcome of that is something that none of them actually want, but that's what they're going to get. Because at the end of that, on the other side of that door, is simply the rule of people, as opposed to the rule of law. And you asked about Canada, and I have views on this, right? Of course. Well, as you know better than I do, Canada oftentimes follows the United States into its politics with some delay. And we could go back and we'd agree on most of that. The current, the Canadian Trump, if you will, right? He has used many of the same things. During the COVID crisis, I don't need to remind you, right? The attack on the Canadian state, the use of the equivalent of the truckers, I just said the truckers revolt, the shutting down of the borders, the attack on the rule of law. It all came, and much of that actually funded by the United States. We don't know how much, but the government was alarmed enough that it shut down people's bank accounts. So it's there, and it's probably going to win the next election. Now we'll see what it actually looks like on the other side. The Canadian version is always a corrupted version of the pure type. In this case, maybe that's a good thing. I don't know, right? But that's what's probably going to happen in Canada. But I think the first two parts of it I can't really address because I got to go on to the other two questions. So the second question was
On the state, whether the state is going away.
Oh, so is the state going away? The project of deconstructing the state in the former Soviet world, it's a very easy one. It was a very easy one because there wasn't much there to begin with, the modern state, and replacing it with something which was sort of already there, right? That is the rule of people, the rule of the clan leader with family and friends. In the case of developed countries, the state itself, the state bureaucracy itself, developed over a very long period of time, right? A very long period of time, several hundred years. And in the case of the United States, it developed in response to really traumatic events. If you read, Theda Skocpol's Soldiers and Mothers, right? Shows you how the idea of the state taking care, having some obligation for its people, it took the Civil War and the trauma of the Civil War, and that produced. And think about, the administrative state, which really grows out of the Great Depression, another traumatic case. And so to pull all of that apart, it takes a while. It takes a while. And it's a slow moving problem. But the problem, this is why COVID was such a wake-up call for them. Because, we'd all gone to those airports for a long time. And you say, what's going on here? Why is it like this? It wasn't like this when I was growing up. That's the world I grew up. Air Canada was this amazing thing, right? And it became that way. And during COVID, we started to see what would happen under catastrophic circumstances. The state is a hedge against, oftentimes, against low probability, but high risk events. We need our state sometimes. We need it, sometimes we need it a lot. So what you're going to see, if I'm right, if the bad scenario happens, is a slow moving deconstruction of the forces in fits and starts, right? They're such bad government. Now, the other thing about them, what they do, somebody asked me, what about Israel and the COVID response? Which is a really good counterpoint, right? Israel was very fast on the counter response to COVID, right? But most of these patrimonial leaders, they use existing state capacity. They harvest it. They harvest it to pass out to their friends and family, and they harvest it to use when needed for a while. But the prediction here is ultimately it gets deconstructed. And I think the bill for that in Israel was paid. And I'm not making a political point here. It was paid on October 7th, October 8th. There was no state. There was no state. There was nothing to respond. The first people at the front, the first people to deliver, clothes and food to Gaza, do you know who they were? It was the protesters in Tel Aviv. It was not the state. The state had been systematically deconstructed by Netanyahu over the last several years, not simply the judiciary, but also these secretaries general of the ministries. Many had been unappointed. That is the senior civil servants, which takes us back to your point. What is the proper level? We're not making a point that the state is always wonderful. And that was Jennifer's point, I think, that, isn't the state, that was your point about the civil service. The civil service is against itself, as it were. That can happen. And we're saying that, look, reasonable people can disagree about how much autonomy the state should have, how much administrative power should be delegated from legislatures to bureaucracies, over whether the state resists what the elected leaders want to do. And I suppose if the elected leaders want to deconstruct their state, that's not anti-democratic. That's not anti-democratic. It's stupid. And those are different things. That's my point, right? And so, yeah, we can disagree. We can disagree on low. My economist friends say, oh, it's just a recipe for high taxes. You're like, you want the entire world. You guys are too young to remember Seinfeld, right? Where Newman is your hero, right? The postal worker, right? Well, no, but what if we didn't have that? Remember the post office with the US elections, that the ballots weren't being delivered. So we need that too. We need all of that. And this modern state, it's the operating system of the world, of the modern world. It's the operating system. And we all don't like Windows once in a while. It's true. But what other operating system do you have out there? The market's not an operating system. The market requires the state. No state, no market. So unless you come up with a better, there's only two ways this can function. It's either going to function patrimonially or it's going to function through the rule of law. And you don't have a choice. And we actually have to kind of grow up and suck it up a bit and say, look, it's perfectly reasonable to try to reform our state, to argue about levels of taxes. But the idea that we're not going to have the state, that a state that's has its own autonomy from any elected executive, that's somehow a deep state conspiracy of shadowy dark forces all run by George Soros, this is insane.
Okay, so we have time for one round of several questions. So Mark, Mark, and then one question in the back there, and I think that will be it. Sorry.
Yeah, it was really interesting.
I think that's not on.
Now, I'm just going to make a very brief observation about financing, what you're talking about. Because you started off by talking about Rockwell. Rockwell was very angry with some 90s when he was more here. and didn't like the fact that not one influential or fighting for that fighting for the rest of it.
Right.
Initially, it seems to me the antidote to what you're saying here, and the point I'm trying to get at, patrimonial societies such as that arouse resistance and arouse emotional trauma if they are not institutions to which you either rationally or emotionally necessarily are going to commit yourself.
Right.
The antidote, it seems to me, if you really want to follow this agenda of supporting a state, of building up the state again, building up respect for the state, and what requires something like civic thinking. But to counter that requires a very different ideological agenda from the kind of rationalistic, progressive, what's the right word, ethos, which is pervaded our society perhaps since the 1960s or not.
Oh, Yeah.
One more, yes, in the back, and then you will have a
You
chance.
see my point?
yes, definitely.
Yeah, yeah. Mhm. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Annabelle. I study European public policy, and because you talked about the state building project in the 1990s by EU officials, my question is about the current enlargement process that is ongoing. I was wondering because the EU still ended up with a leader like Orban in office. What would be the implications, and what do you think? To what extent do you think 2004 enlargement is comparable to today? And what do you think could be done to prevent another leader similar to Orban in the EU? Thank you.
So,
Ultimately, so this question of antidote. In the broader sweep of history, the world has changed from one based on emotion and personal loyalty. It's not that emotions don't matter now, but they don't dictate the structure of society. We deal with each other, you and I, all of us in here, through law. I tell my students sometimes, when I keep the door of my office open at all times. Of course, all professors know that. Why? Well, because I'm afraid of you. And sitting beside me at all time is the lead counsel of Shapiro, and Shapiro. He is sitting there. It's supposed to be funny. It's a Jewish joke. He's sitting beside me at all time. Right? He protects me. We talk to each other through lawyers. Is that alienating? Do we lose something in society? I used to have a drink with my professor. We don't do that. That's gone because that protects the students and that protects us. We've created a society in which we interact with each other on the basis of regulation, not emotion, not based on trust. Although it's always there, it should be there. It's better if it's there, but ultimately it doesn't matter if it's there. I treat you as if I trust you. I treat you as if I respect you because law dictates that I do. I don't think we're going to like the other side of the door if we get rid of that. So the ultimate for me, it may sound bloodless and technocratic, and maybe Steve doesn't agree with me on this. But I think that the society that we've created and the state that we've created is too precious to deconstruct just because we're pissed off. You sure?
But it surely also needs a sense of nation and a sense of love and admiration for those institutions.
Yes. Yes, and to the extent that the solution exists, it's going to be some form of state that we feel a sense of loyalty towards. But the sense of loyalty should not be should be based upon enlightened reason. It should not be based on kind of blind love and loyalty in the way you're thinking about it, right? It's enlightened reason. I mean, I'm enough of an enlightenment person. Right? I'm married to a Habermasian, so that absolutely, that's my view. Well, I know you're giving the Burkean view, but ultimately Burke said, a queen is but a woman, a king is but a man, right? And we're going to lose all the beautiful illusions of the pre-modern world. We can't live that way anymore. Our world is complicated. Big populous societies are very complicated affairs, and we have to take them seriously. And the only institution we have for taking them seriously is the state. And we seem to have lost that view. So, and the last question was, sorry.
Enlargement.
Enlargement. To repeat what I said at the beginning, enlargement in the first round at any rate was about creating the regulatory state. I mean, if you look at the European Union, everything from the production of steel to the transportation of geese, it's all regulated. Everything is regulated, and providing the new states, allowing them in meant giving them that, because if they could not do that, they didn't belong in the EU. And I assume any subsequent, there's been the feeling, right, that admitting Orban was an error. Admitting Orban's Hungary was an error. And I'm not so sure. They were all democratic. They had a regulatory regime, but he's attempting to kind of chip away at the edges at it. The Hungarians are extremely clever. Orban's government is extremely clever. Orban's advisors are all lawyers. And they sort of use and this is again Jennifer's point, they're using the rule of law against the rule of law. All his kind of Orban's patrimonial revolution is all being introduced legally. And so I suppose any subsequent rounds of enlargement should keep that experience in mind. I'm not sure there's any perfect way out of it. There is no perfect institutional fix to the problem of modernity, except for appreciating its gains, which I think we're about to squander. I'm very worried about that. Obviously, I'm worried about it. So thank you very much.
So thank you, Jeff. On that happy and optimistic note, thank you for coming.